as lonely as can be, 'cause no one in the world seems to love me. And I guess I will turn to the sea to watch over me. Poseidon, please hear me, 'cause Zeus don't understand. I'm much too old to be a boy, but I sure ain't a man. And I guess I will turn to the sea to watch over me. So that's a bit of a song I wrote a couple of years ago when I was trying to come up with a Beach Boys knockoff, and I ended up putting it on my new album, Crabby Starfish and the Herons Remain, an album chock full of songs with loose or more specific ocean references and to the oceany part of the world I know, which is coastal Maine. And I even have this silly record up on the wall called Coasts of Maine by a guy called Hal Lone Pine. I've never listened to it. I just got it because I thought the picture and the name of it was too good for my family, given our connection to that part of the world. But anyway, I'm doing this all in introduction to today's guest, Terese Pierre, who is an editor with Augur magazine and a poet who's been published in all kinds of publications, been recognized with award nominations. She's someone who's, very accomplished in her field, and I like to find little ways to connect to the guest before I interview them, either by covering one of their songs or playing one of my songs that's related. And I just noticed there's a lot of ocean content in her poems. So even though we're familiar with very different oceans, she talks a lot about the Caribbean Sea. I'm talking about further north in the Atlantic. And even though my songs are sort of direct and to the point, and she's writing poetry, I thought this would be a fun way to start this interview. But now, for all of you poets out there, all of you looking to find out more about poetry, and particularly speculative poetry, let's hear what Terese has to offer. So I'm joined today by Terese Pierre. And Terese, to give you some context, this started out as a project where I was interviewing different singer-songwriters, and then I thought I'd expand to other people pursuing artistic directions, whatever those may be. And I took a particular interest in poets after I heard Bob Dylan commenting on how when he was a kid, lots of people would have known poetry. And since then, it's become a more obscure art. There's not a top 40 of poetry in the same way there is with music. So why don't you start by telling us how you got into this art form and what drives you as you pursue it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's really great to be here. Well, I kind of understand that sentiment that you brought up earlier about poetry being a little bit more obscure. My family, they sort of raised me with poetry. I read a lot of, when I was younger, of course, I would read like children's poetry. I read a lot of Shel Silverstein.
Right.
And like, he's great. I still have some of his books on my shelf, and I was just taught that poetry is fun, and I've been reading it all my life. I stopped reading it for a while in high school because I had other things to read, of course, for work and school. But I picked it back up again in about 2017, reading and writing poetry. It's always been fun to me, but it's never been a way personally to sort of express myself or my emotions. A lot of people I know have written like, the angsty teen poetry. When they were younger, you break up with your partner and you're upset and you write that poem. It's never been like that for me. I've always explored poetry as an art form, as it was always something that I wanted to get better at. I am always interested in sort of learning about the ways that other poets engage with the art form and the ways in which they use language to sort of talk about the world and their experience of it. So I love poetry for a lot of those reasons.
Well, that's great. So it's funny. My journey started with Shel Silverstein in kindergarten. I read the poem Strange Restaurant for my class, but unfortunately I kind of stopped there. So for those of us with no relationship, what were the next steps to you? What were poets that sort of made you interested in wanting to master this craft?
I read a lot of sort of contemporaries, I guess. When I was in university, I took a poetry class, of course, and it was one of like the most fun classes that I read. Um, I read a lot of Oscar Wilde. I read Lucille Clifton. I read some of Maya Angelou's work. And then sort of like as I got older and like left university, I started surrounding myself with a lot of poets. And it felt kind of odd to be like, my friend is a poet, but then these people would also have like, books and go on readings and things like that. So other poets that I really love currently that continue to inform my work and whose style and voice I try to emulate at times include people like Faith Arkerful, Fawn Parker, Kashayar Mohammadi, JC Bouchard, Dion Brand, and Kinesia Lubrin. And these are like living people that I know, right? And
For
I'm
sure.
constantly trying to like work on my own craft through their reading their work.
Right. I guess what I was going for, so again, with those children's poems, usually there's an obvious hook to them. There'll be like an illustration or there's something very silly. Once you move beyond that, is there something you would describe as the hook, whether it's Oscar Wilde or one of your contemporary peers? What is it about those works that makes you fall in love with them?
Oh, right. Sorry for misunderstanding.
No problem.
For me, I'm really in love with like language, and I feel like poetry is such a great place to sort of experiment with language. So I'm always interested in like ways that poets will describe things, and I'm looking. Sometimes I look for both as a reader and as an editor of poetry, little moments of defamiliarization. So like showing something like normal, like that we would see in everyday life, but in a weird or strange way that causes me to sort of rethink my relationship with that object or that feeling or whatever the poet is describing at that time. So that's something I look for, is that defamiliarization aspect. Something else I look for is really interesting, like adjective noun combinations
Right.
in lines. So like the example I go to is often like a swollen hug.
Hmm.
I didn't find this in a poem, I found this in a story, but that's an example of something
Right.
some of the things that I would look for. That's what sort of hooks me in a poem. That's what carries me through.
Right. So let's focus a bit more now on you as a creator. My sense from reading about you a bit, artistically, you're a poet. Academically, you're more an analyst of speculative fiction. How about you? Why don't you expand on those for us?
Sure. Well, I'm not in academia anymore, but yeah, I write a lot of different things. I write poetry, and I write short fiction, and I write creative nonfiction. And within poetry, I do literary poetry, and then I do speculative poetry. And within short fiction, I also do like literary fiction and speculative fiction. So I'm doing a lot of different kinds of writing. Um, but my passions right now are are poetry and then speculative literature. I work with Augur magazine. I came on initially as a poetry editor, like right in the beginning when they were just sort of starting up, and I was able to sort of read and curate the poems that the magazine received, and that was a really great role. And I enjoyed being a part of that. And now I'm one of the editors in chief. There are two of us. And I have a good time sort of expanding on the things that we can publish. Personally, I like the kinds of poems that I'm drawn to, like vary. I never really know like what it is about a poem that will sort of, um, you know, make me fall in love with it. I know I explained it in like the previous question, but now I'm thinking about it again. I'm like, wait a minute, what do I actually love?
Right.
Um,
Well, maybe we could talk about the relationship between poetry and speculative. So I'm coming
sure.
from a very basic place. My understanding, speculative, it's a category of science fiction. Like, how does that map onto poetry?
Sure. So speculative literature, it's a very broad umbrella term that encompasses like other genres like science fiction, fantasy, horror, surrealism, superhero, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic, all of those genres that sort of exist in like the unreality and imagined. All of that falls under speculative literature, and you can sort of write about that in the context of fiction, or in poetry. So speculative poetry is poetry that sort of engages in these genres as well. There's a lot of sci-fi poetry, fantasy poetry that features like dragons and like mermaids and things like that. I've written a couple like that. I've written a couple of like apocalyptic poetry. So that's kind of like what speculative poetry as it is used today kind of means. And there's often a lot of discussion about like, when is a poem like not speculative enough or too speculative? But I think poetry as a form is probably the most sympathetic to speculative literature and to speculative elements, because I feel like the poem itself is very speculative. Because like the question of what is a poem, you know, like people could spend like years answering that question. So I feel like it works really well. I find that sometimes that I would write the future like into my poems. I like to make up things in my poetry. I don't write a lot about my life. And a lot of poets do, but I don't. So I'll sort of invent these little scenarios. And then I'm like, oh, a speaker is doing this or going to this place. And it's never happened to me before. But then like I'll look back on that poem 2 years like later and be like, oh, I've experienced this thing now. So it kind of gets speculative in that way. But no, I never call these poems speculative. I'm just writing what I feel.
Right. So
it's kind of a weird thing.
I think I heard you talking about this in another interview. You talked about persona poetry.
Yeah.
And that sounds like a real risk, because I feel like more and more, you know, everything we say is analyzed. You know, what does it mean that you share that belief? I mean, have you ever felt uncomfortable jumping into someone else's skin and saying something that maybe Terese wouldn't say or think?
I've never really explored that in the context of discomfort. I treat persona poetry the same way I write fiction. But of course, the same problem also applies. You can have the same thing. Like people talk about like Lolita, for example. But I've never experienced that. I'm not really worried. I call it and I described this in an interview, an innocence in form of entitlement. I feel like if you, the reader, are going to just assume that I, the writer, I'm writing about my life, then I feel like that's on you and not so much on me. I feel like as writers, we are not, like, the readers are not entitled to our personal lives. I feel like that's a choice that we get to make, or artists in general. And sometimes if I'm public about it, then I'm public about it. But if I'm not, then I feel like that's an extra step that people have to take. So I'm not worried about, you know, embodying a persona that isn't mine, because I'm doing that careful work anyway. Right?
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, like morally, you're right. And I don't know where this comes from, but I feel like with novels and with movies, yeah, we don't assume the author is a perspective, but I guess there's something about the concision of poetry and of song where there is this default assumption that it's confessional. So I guess all we can do to change that is just say, this is not what we're doing. And you seem to really emphasize that.
I try to, yeah.
So one theme I've noticed in a few of your poems is a lot of ocean and fish imagery. In a recent poem, Fins, you write, he wraps his legs round her hips, feels the cool sweep of fish like the ones his grandmother buys. At the carnage, their shiny gray scale dead eyes, his mouth opens and, oh, I assume like a fish mouth there. And you have another poem called Fishing. There's a part that goes, this body between us is dangerous, a writhing prehistoric wound. Our bodies are weapons, and we know that no one wants this fish or its live birth, just its teeth around our neck. And I think you're talking about a shark there. Talk about the image of fish for you and why that's recurring in your poetry.
You're asking great questions. Okay, so I think it's not so much fish. I just like writing about oceans, and I feel like, well, fish live in the ocean, so I should write about fish too. I like the ocean. I think the ocean is great. My family is from the Caribbean, and it's a series of islands in the ocean. So there's a lot of like sands and like trees and sky and water and sun and moon. A lot of nature themes in my poems in general. The first poem that you quoted, it was about a mermaid, I believe. Well, I believe I wrote it. It's about a mermaid.
Right.
So I thought that was a really interesting bit of fantasy to sort of touch upon. I honestly don't know how to answer that question. other than other than saying I like to talk about nature, but I would need to think a little bit more about like why fish. Like that's so interesting. Thank you for
Right.
that. I'm sorry, but
I mean, fish have haunted me from a young age. I think because living in urban society, a lot of meat people only see as like little squares of pink and brown, whereas seafood, you actually sometimes still see the full body of the thing. So there was something particularly haunting for me about fish all my life. And then particularly in that Finn's poem, though it changes a bit now that you say it was more about our mermaid, it seems like you were constantly going back and forth between the living fish and the dead fish, almost creating this kind of ghost figure. So that's what I got out of it.
Yeah, I wanted to write about, or wanted to imply like a sense of danger as well in that poem, at that part that you read. But yeah, I guess like we guess readers, or we can talk about fish as like, especially in urban society, it's like a far away thing, like things that we aren't, like the ocean especially, it's just not something we have access to generally. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm grateful.
think about it
So
now.
another motif that you sort of hinted at there, and in different places I've seen you talk about your various homes, Grenada and Trinidad and Tobago, and you also talked in this piece on Afrofuturism about how it was important in I think it was Brown Girl in the Ring, that not just that it was Afrofuturism, but that it was Toronto centered Afrofuturism. So how does, I guess we've talked a bit about the islands and then Toronto and the idea of home come out in your work?
Yeah, reading Nalo Hawkinson's Brown Girl in the Ring was really pivotal for me because so far, but prior to reading her books, I had not read any speculative fiction by a Black woman at all. I know Octavia Butler is very famous. I just had not heard of her, like, at all. And so to learn that, Nalo Hopkinson like lived in Toronto for a very long time and was a place where I lived, I felt a really deep connection to that story and to the characters. As I'm someone who's like not super well traveled as well. Like I lived in the Caribbean for 3 years when I was small, even though I was born in Mississauga. So my exposure to that sort of culture and that lifestyle is very limited. And I guess like now in my adulthood, it's also sort of like, I see it through rose-colored glasses almost. So I wanted to sort of focus my speculative literature, any fiction that I would write, on something that I was like living in currently, the place I was currently existing in, and that was Toronto. I consider Toronto my home. I've lived here for almost 16 years. And there's still so much to discover about the city. People can say what they want about Toronto, that's fine. I think it's really cool. And so I like to think about like what speculative literature and speculative fiction could look like in the city, like set in Toronto. So that's something I want to keep exploring as well as like what like Afrofuturism and what Blackness can look like in Canada specifically. When people talk about Afrofuturism, they talk about Africa, or they talk about the Caribbean, or they talk about America. But I'm like, what about Canada? Like, Black people have a history in Canada too, right? We didn't just appear. So what does that look like? How can that be speculated? How can that be made mythical and more exciting? And I think Brown Girl in the Ring does that to an extent, and that's why I love that book.
Right. Yeah, I think I saw a movie of it at a festival in Montreal. I don't know if that went anywhere, but it was certainly surreal, just like seeing the CN Tower of the background. It was just otherwise a science fiction movie, but there's something impactful for sure about saying, oh, this could happen in a place that's familiar. I thought nothing special was supposed to happen in what was familiar. Anyway, we've talked a lot about your influences, your art form. What do you have planned artistically going forward?
I am trying to write a book. And this book is going to be, I don't know what it's called, but I'm writing a book. It's going to be more nature influence, more oceans and things like that. I like to write a lot about desire and conflict and what happens when people can't get what they want, even though they want it really bad. So a lot of my poetry moving forward is about that. I'm also trying to write more short stories. I haven't written short stories in a while. And I want to set them all in Toronto because Toronto's cool. I'm writing one currently that's sort of focused around all the parks in Toronto. So I'm going around to different parks sometimes to see what they look like. But with my work with Augur, we have our newest issues coming out, and we're working on some programming as well for the fall. So I'm doing that too.
Excellent. So just as a little postscript, different part of your art, I noticed on your Instagram, you have this weird uniformity to all your photos. It's your face in front of the same background, and then you do this slightly different eye makeup thing every time. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I for a while, I think I started in like March 2020. I was doing like these like book looks kind of thing. So like these makeup looks inspired by book covers. And I'm technically still doing them. I haven't really, I pause and start, occasionally. And I started doing that because I really wanted to express how much I loved reading the book I was reading. I was doing a review, and then I was like, I finished the book, finished a review, and I was like, wow, how else can I show that this book was awesome? So I put the cover colors on my face, and I just kept doing that for 2020, and other authors joined in, and I wanted to use that to also highlight the work of BIPOC writers, but not all the authors. I do this for our BIPOC. And it was just fun, and it sort of like took off over Twitter and Instagram, and people were like, you do the book looks, and I'm like, yeah. And it was really fun. So I take the photos, like this is like the yellow chick that's like in the background of all my photos, because I take my photos by the window. But that's what that is. It's fun. I love it. I just to relax, because I have so much makeup in my bathroom that I never wear. So I wanted to like use that opportunity to just wear the makeup that I had. So that's where that came from.
Yeah, no, I mean, I found it fun for sure. Well, Terese, this has been great. Do you have a poem you can share with us today?
This is a newer one I wrote. It's called Bathing, and there aren't any fish in this poem, I don't think. So there is water though. All right, Bathing, after Lucia Lorenzi. Today I put my body into a river, upset to find I'm only half stone. I tried to live in a swamp once. I love how everything was one color and the color of my skin. Two things out of place: the white sky and all the red birds that saunter airily like tourists. Any vacation I take is the right one. Fresh water seems further from the center. My cellular history sees riches in the sunlight fleeing the surface. My feet slip, and I think of grime and green water. How many voices leave my lips? How many times I copy civil dusk for a community of hands and hips. Distance sings a salve for the right skin, and I want to turn my face to the dirt that sloughs through time. It is beyond me and any sweet foreign smell that shrinks, threatens, and exalts. My brother's hair, a redolent fish, a black varnish overall. I got it. You got that fish. It's just in.
I did.
So I saw the line. I was like, oh no, I lied. There's a fish here. I'm having a crisis now. I have to go back and look at all my poems and find the fish.
Right.
Thank you, though. This is great. This was
Yeah.
great. I need that. I needed this.
Yeah. I mean, I can see what's going on symbolically. The way my mind works is I'm wondering, do you literally enjoy the idea of swimming in a swamp, or is it just a powerful way of conveying escape from societal discrimination and otherness, that you have to run away to this place a lot of people think of as unpleasant?
Yes. This poem is very new. I haven't had time to like think about like what it means. So I appreciate this. This is great. I love talking about poetry because I get to hear people's interpretations. But sure, if this is what you're getting from it, yeah, I'm gonna say yes. You have my approval.
Okay, so
exactly
you would literally bathe in swamp water to
no. Well, the I is not me. This is the persona.
Oh,
right? Not,
true.
right,
Yeah,
right.
I'm
yeah,
forgetting.
So
Yes,
I have, I have visited swamps before. Not I haven't seen people bathe in the swamps, but they're interesting spaces generally.
yes, and it also not too related to what we were talking about today, but it brings me back to this terrifying children's novel I read earlier this year called The Underneath. So just a recommendation of a book on the side. But anyway, Terese, this has been great. It's nice to get to know you today, and people should check out your work.
Thank you so much. This is really cool. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks.
Thanks. So that was my interview with Terese Pierre, and man, we connected over that fish thing more than I thought, and it's just great timing because I recently did this rough little painting of a mackerel that I saw popping its head out of the water in Maine, and my wife got it framed for me, and it's up on the wall, and it was here on time for the interview, and so I hope you check out Terese's work. And as to end this in a silly little way, I figure I'd play a verse from one of my oldest songs, a song I don't play very much anymore because I don't think it's very good. This was back in a time when I thought you just sort of you put as many words or facts into a song and you don't worry too much about rhythm. I now know that, rhythm is a pretty essential part of a song and not choking on your words. But anyway, here's a song I wrote way back in 2011 called The Slammin' Salmon. Because that's what you are. They dip you in ketchup, you're done. You grow and the cannibals kill. The trout and the kingfisher force you to run. But since you've been an alevin, you've been hurting yourself survive. You'll pull your head out of the beaver dam. You'll see the ocean alive. And we'll cry, you're a miracle fish. Your smoking process is Darwin's green. You aren't a human with critics and doubters. I think you can be a champion. I know idea why, but today I proclaim that you are the slammin' salmon.